According to sources close to diplomatic and military circles in Asia, China has made a principled decision to no longer remain a passive observer amid the rapidly unfolding crisis around Greenland. Officially, Beijing continues to adhere to an extremely restrained line. Representatives of the PRC Ministry of Foreign Affairs avoid harsh wording and limit themselves to abstract statements about the need for stability, respect for international law, and the inadmissibility of escalation. However, according to insiders within the Chinese political establishment, behind closed doors in Beijing, what is happening is perceived as a strategic triumph. The US has effectively begun to dismantle the very system on which its global dominance was built for decades. In the eyes of the Chinese leadership, Washington is doing exactly what it accused Beijing and Moscow of for many years, undermining the sovereignty of allies, ignoring international norms, and effectively calling into question the very idea of collective security. Analytical memos circulating among Chinese military and economic planners state directly that the crisis around Greenland has become the first case in modern history in which NATO is under threat not because of an external adversary, but because of the actions of its own leader. And it is precisely this that opens a window of opportunity for China that may not appear again. According to sources, the People's Liberation Army of China has been put on heightened alert, and the PLA Navy has begun redeploying a significant number of ships to northern latitudes. Formally, these actions are explained by planned exercises, scientific missions, and the protection of trade routes, but the scale and directions of fleet movements speak for themselves. This is not a demonstrative gesture or symbolic presence, but a systemic strengthening of Chinese activity in a region that until recently was considered an exclusive zone of US and European influence. According to one Asian military analyst cited by regional media, without unity between Washington and Brussels, Denmark finds itself in an extremely vulnerable position, and China intends to use this moment to protect its own strategic interests. At the same time, insiders emphasize that Beijing does not view Greenland exclusively as a source of resources, although rare earth metals, uranium, and other strategic materials certainly matter. Much more important for China is something else: the rapidly changing geography of global trade. Global warming is leading to the melting of Arctic ice, and what until recently was considered inaccessible and theoretical is becoming reality. This concerns the formation of a new Arctic trade route capable of radically changing global logistics. This route, passing through northern waters, allows the distance between Asia and Europe to be reduced by thousands of kilometers compared to traditional routes via the Suez Canal. For China, as the world's largest trading power, this means not just savings in time and fuel, but also a reduction in dependence on narrow and vulnerable choke points of global trade, such as the Malacca Strait or the Suez. In Chinese strategic documents, the Arctic has long been viewed as a future northern Silk Road, and the crisis around Greenland creates conditions for the accelerated implementation of these plans. The presence of the Chinese fleet in the region in this context looks not like an attempt to protect Greenland, but like the protection of China's own long-term interests in a rapidly changing world. But there is also another, far more cynical, and at the same time pragmatic calculation that sources close to the Chinese leadership speak about. For Beijing, it is extremely important that the US go all the way in its confrontation with Europe and, in the worst-case scenario for the West, actually decide on the use of force to seize Greenland. In that case, according to Chinese strategists, Washington's main moral and political argument in the Taiwan issue will be completely destroyed. For decades, the US has declared the inadmissibility of changing borders by force, appealed to international law, and demanded restraint from other countries. If the Americans themselves are the first to cross this line by seizing the territory of an ally, any future accusations against China will lose their legitimacy. In such a world, according to analysts in Beijing, a Chinese operation against Taiwan would no longer be seen as an exception, but as part of a new global reality in which the right of the strong finally replaces international norms. That is precisely why China is sending its ships to the Arctic region, not to side with Denmark or to confront the US, but to fix its presence at a moment when the old system is cracking at the seams. The administration of Donald Trump, in the view of many experts, is now facing a choice that could become a point of no return. A decision in favor of a force-based scenario around Greenland is capable of permanently changing the course of current history, accelerating the transition of the world into an era of open power rivalry without rules or constraints. Whether this decision proves correct or catastrophic will be shown by time, but one thing is already clear. The consequences of this step will go far beyond a single island and will affect the entire global order as we have known it. Against this backdrop, a formulation that was previously used exclusively in closed strategic discussions is being heard more and more often in Beijing, a moment of historical shift. According to sources familiar with the contents of reports now being presented to the top leadership of the PRC, Chinese analysts proceed from the assumption that the world is entering a phase in which former alliances are no longer unbreakable, and the decisions of a single leader can nullify decades of diplomacy in a matter of weeks. That is why China, insiders claim, is acting with extreme caution externally while remaining maximally consistent internally. The strengthening of naval presence is accompanied by intensified intelligence activity, diplomatic contacts, and economic initiatives aimed at entrenching China in the Arctic as a long-term player. In Chinese expert circles, it is emphasized that this is not about an immediate confrontation with the US, but about fixing a new reality in which Beijing no longer agrees to remain a passive observer while the West itself dismantles its own rules. Particular attention is paid to Europe's reaction. If European countries prove incapable of responding collectively to pressure from Washington, this will become final proof for China that the era of a unified West has ended. In that case, Chinese strategists believe Beijing gains the opportunity to build relations directly with individual states, bypassing old blocs and alliances. Sources note that it is precisely in this context that the Chinese fleet in Arctic waters becomes not so much a military factor as a political signal. China is here for the long term, and it is ready to defend its interests in any configuration of the future world. At the same time, Beijing is fully aware of the risks. Any mistake, overly sharp move, or open confrontation could trigger a chain reaction that China does not yet seek. But there will be no return to the former passive role. The crisis around Greenland, in the view of Chinese analysts, has become a kind of test for the entire international system, and the results of this test are being carefully recorded. If the Trump administration decides on further escalation, this will definitively confirm for Beijing that the global order has entered a phase of irreversible change. In this new world, China intends to be not an object of pressure, but one of the architects of future rules, even if those rules prove far harsher and more dangerous than anything humanity has become accustomed to over recent decades. That is why Beijing is increasingly speaking about the need to act preemptively, while the strategic window has not yet closed. For China, this is not a matter of ambition, but a matter of survival in a system where the rules are changing faster than new security guarantees can be formed.